Imagine being just 14 years old, standing alone at a busy mall, realizing your parents had vanished, not by accident, but on purpose. That was the moment my world cracked open. Hi, I'm Avery, and what started as a harmless joke turned into the journey that defined my entire life. Have you ever had someone you trusted turn their back on you? Stick around, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done if it happened to you? I always thought Saturdays were supposed to be lazy, a time for soft pretzels, window shopping, and maybe, if you were lucky, a slice of pizza at the food court. That's what I expected that morning at Oak Ridge Mall. I didn't expect my parents to disappear. I didn't expect the laughter, theirs, not mine, to fade away like smoke in the summer heat. We pulled into the crowded parking lot just after 10, the air already sticky with humidity. Peter Carter, my father, drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, impatience written all over his face. Laura Carter, my mother, reapplied her lipstick in the passenger seat, barely glancing at me in the back. I hugged my small purse to my chest, heart fluttering like it always did when I tried too hard to make the day go right. The mall smelled exactly how I remembered, sweet, warm, like Cinnabon and buttered popcorn fighting for your attention. I wanted to lose myself in it to believe this would be a normal outing, but that was before Dad barked, "Go grab some pretzels, Avery. We'll be over there." No explanation, no smile, just an order tossed over his shoulder as he and Mom wandered off toward a jewelry store. I hesitated, watching them drift away. Mom's head turned once, and for a second, I thought she might smile, reassure me. Instead, she pointed at the food court and mouthed, "Go." I obeyed. I always obeyed. At the Auntie Anne's kiosk, I fumbled for a $5 bill, my hands clumsy. The cashier, a teenage boy who barely looked up from his phone, handed me a bag of warm pretzel bites and a paper cup of lemonade. I turned, balancing my snack, scanning the sea of faces for my parents. They weren't there. Maybe they had moved to another bench. Maybe they were browsing the stores just beyond the fountain. I perched on a bench, nibbling at a pretzel bite, my stomach knotting tighter with each passing minute. I checked my watch. 10 minutes, then 20. By 30 minutes, the lemonade was warm in my hand and the pretzels tasted like rubber. I pulled out my old flip phone. The one Mom said made me look like a kid too young for a smartphone. One new message blinked on the tiny screen. "Let's see how she figures it out this time." Followed by a laughing emoji. The pretzel bag crinkled loudly in my fist. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping when I opened them, I'd see them laughing nearby, waiting to shout, "Surprise!" But the space around me remained stubbornly empty. Just strangers brushing past, busy with their own lives, not a single familiar face. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay still. If I panicked, if I cried, it would only prove their point. I thought about the other tests they'd given me over the years. Being locked out of the house for forgetting to bring in the mail, walking home 5 miles from school in the rain because I missed the bus. Every time, it was framed as a lesson. "Building character," Dad said. "Teaching you independence," Mom chirped. But this was different. This was abandonment, plain and simple. I pressed my palms against the worn denim of my jeans, grounding myself. Small, shaky breaths. Don't cry here. Not where everyone could see. Not where some other mom might glance at me with pity and call security. I watched the people swirl around me. Mothers pushing strollers, teenagers laughing over milkshakes, old couples holding hands, all moving, living, safe in their little pockets of normalcy. And me? I sat rooted to that hard plastic bench, clutching my crumpled pretzel bag like a life raft. Maybe if I stayed still long enough, they'd come back. Maybe this was all a mistake, a joke that had gone too far. Maybe, number. The text said it all. They wanted to see how long I would last on my own. They wanted to watch me squirm. Tears threatened, stinging the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them away. I had learned long ago that weakness was something you paid for dearly in my family. The mall's bright lights seemed harsher now. The cheerful pop music echoing through the atrium grated against my nerves. I dug my fingernails into the soft pretzel bag, crumpling it beyond repair, grounding myself in the small, tangible hurt of it. In that moment, surrounded by hundreds of strangers, I realized something bone deep. They weren't coming back. Not soon. Maybe not at all. And I, 14-year-old Avery Carter, had to figure out what survival looked like on my own. I stood up slowly, legs trembling. I looked around again, one last desperate sweep of the crowd. Nothing. No Peter, no Laura, just me, a pretzel, and the sinking certainty that, from now on, I was alone. It wasn't just a walk home. It was a quiet rebellion, a vow stitched into every tired step I took across the parking lot and out onto the open sidewalk. I wasn't just walking back to the house. I was walking away from something bigger, something that had ruled my whole childhood without me even realizing it. Trust. The drizzle started almost as soon as I reached the edge of the mall property. A fine mist at first, clinging to my hair and eyelashes, then growing heavier, soaking through the thin cotton of my hoodie. I pulled it tighter around my shoulders, fingers numb against the damp fabric. Each drop felt like a tiny needle, a reminder that I was out here alone, and it was going to stay that way. I hadn't made it far when a figure appeared ahead, moving toward me under the yellow glow of a flickering street lamp. Mall security. Mr. Davis, I remembered vaguely. He was older, probably near retirement, with a permanent slouch and kind eyes. He squinted through the mist, slowing when he spotted me. "You all right, sweetheart?" he asked, voice gentle, concerned. My first instinct was to tell him everything, to spill it all right there on the sidewalk, the pretzels now cold and forgotten in my crumpled bag. But old lessons ran deeper than instinct. I forced a tight smile, the kind that didn't reach my eyes. "I'm fine," I said, hitching my backpack higher on my shoulder. "You sure? Mall's closing soon. Don't want you out here by yourself." "I'm just meeting someone," I lied. My voice was steady, practiced. "They're on their way." Mr. Davis hesitated, scanning the empty parking lot behind me, his mouth pressed into a thin line, like he didn't believe me but couldn't push harder without making a scene. Finally, he gave a small nod. "All right. Be careful, kid." I watched him disappear back toward the mall entrance, a lonely figure swallowed by the mist and fluorescent lights. I turned in the opposite direction and kept walking. The world felt bigger than it had ever been before. Each block stretched out longer than the last, the familiar neighborhoods distorted by the creeping darkness and my own rising panic. Porch lights flickered here and there, casting uneven pools of safety that I avoided instinctively, like an animal dodging predators. I didn't want attention. Attention led to questions, and questions led to trouble. I shifted the pretzel bag from one hand to the other, the grease soaking through the paper onto my palm. In my pocket, I had 2 crumpled dollar bills. No phone, no backup plan. Just a vague memory of the way home, stitched together from years of riding in the back seat, half asleep after long days of running errands. The drizzle became a steady rain. My sneakers squelched against the cracked sidewalks, the water sneaking in through invisible seams. I stumbled once over a lifted slab of concrete, catching myself against a street sign. Pain flared in my wrist, sharp and angry, but I kept moving. I had no other choice. Halfway down Lincoln Avenue, a car slowed beside me. My heart leapt into my throat before I even looked. A silver minivan rolled to a cautious stop, the window sliding down with a soft, mechanical hum. A woman leaned out, middle-aged brown hair pulled into a messy bun, kind lines crinkling around her eyes. "Hey, honey," she called gently. "You okay? You need a ride somewhere?" I froze. Every warning I had ever heard about strangers screamed in my ears. Stranger danger, kidnappings, worse. But there was something about her voice, soft and maternal, that made my knees buckle with longing. Still, Fear won out. I shook my head, backing away a step. "I'm fine," I croaked, my throat raw from cold and swallowed tears. She didn't press, just gave a sad little nod and pulled away slowly, leaving me standing alone under the hiss of the rain. The rest of the walk blurred into a miserable haze. The world shrank to the narrow path ahead of me, my breath puffing in shallow bursts, my arms wrapped tight around myself. Somewhere in the distance, cicadas droned, their endless hum the only music to my march. When I finally turned onto our street, the sky had slipped into full darkness. The familiar row of houses loomed ahead, windows glowing softly through curtains. Warmth, families, laughter. Not mine. Our house stood dark and still, the porch light dead, the driveway empty. No sign of the car, no sign they had even come home yet. I trudged up the path, water dripping from the ends of my sleeves, my shoes squelching with every step. For a moment I stood on the porch staring at the door, waiting for something. An apology, a hug, a dumb laugh, maybe, followed by, "We were just kidding." Nothing. I reached for the doorknob. It turned easily in my hand, unlocked. I stepped inside to a cold, silent house. No lights, no movement, just the hollow echo of my own footsteps on the hardwood floor. I left a trail of wet footprints behind me as I wandered into the kitchen, dropping the ruined pretzel bag into the trash with a soggy thud. I peeled off my soaked hoodie and hung it over a chair to drip onto the tile. For a long time, I stood there, arms wrapped around myself, teeth chattering quietly in the empty room. In that cold silence, a thought anchored itself deep inside me, more solid than anything I had ever known. I would never trust them again. Some people grow up building dreams. I grew up building escape plans. After that day at the mall, something shifted inside me. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, slow, like a hairline crack running through glass. At home, I became a shadow of myself. I spoke when spoken to, nodded when expected, kept my head down. It was safer that way. My parents didn't notice, or if they did, they didn't care enough to say anything. Mornings were the worst. The kitchen always smelled faintly of burnt toast and old coffee, but the silence was thicker than anything hanging in the air. I would sit at the table, hands folded neatly in my lap, while Peter read the paper and Laura scrolled through her phone. They barely looked up. Sometimes Peter would glance over the top of the newspaper and mutter, "What's with the attitude?" Like my silence was some great offense. Laura, without missing a beat, would sigh dramatically and call me ungrateful, as if I had rejected some great blessing by not playing along with the family charade. I learned to hollow out my laughter at dinner, to force smiles at the appropriate moments. I said thank you even when there was nothing to be thankful for. I moved like a ghost through my own life, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of their convenience. Every Saturday morning, Aunt Joanne would take me out for breakfast at a little diner tucked between a laundromat and a florist shop. It was nothing fancy. Cracked vinyl booths, coffee that tasted like burnt dreams. But it smelled like warmth and safety. Bacon sizzling on the griddle, pancakes drowning in syrup, a place where people laughed without looking over their shoulders. That morning in early autumn, the trees were starting to blush red and gold. I sat across from Aunt Joanne, tracing lazy circles on the tabletop with one finger, while she sipped her coffee and watched me with quiet concern. "You've been quiet lately," she said gently, her voice low enough that no one else could hear. I shrugged, poking at my scrambled eggs. They were perfect, fluffy and just a little buttery, but my appetite had disappeared somewhere between the front door and the booth. Aunt Joanne didn't push. She just let the silence stretch, filling the space with steady patience. That was the thing about her. She knew when words would only make things worse. Finally, I whispered, almost too softly to hear, "Sometimes it feels like I'm a problem they forgot to solve." Aunt Joanne's hand froze mid-air, coffee cup suspended between the table and her lips. She set it down slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. "You're not a problem, Avery," she said, her voice firm in a way that didn't allow for argument. "You're a person, and people aren't puzzles you fix. They're lives you honor." The words wrapped around me like a blanket I hadn't realized I needed. I blinked quickly, pushing away the sting behind my eyes. She reached into her purse, rummaging for a moment before sliding a small box across the table. I frowned, confused, and lifted the lid. Inside was a prepaid flip phone. Simple, basic, no frills. "In case you ever need it," she said, her voice light, but her eyes serious. I stared at it, the weight of what she was offering sinking in. Not just a phone, a lifeline. A way out if I ever needed to make the kind of call that couldn't wait for permission. I remembered something she'd told me once, years ago, when I was barely tall enough to reach the kitchen counter. If you ever need a way out, don't wait for someone to hand it to you. Build your own door. Back then, I thought she was talking about careers or college applications. Now, sitting in that booth with the smell of bacon in the air and the cheap tabletop warm under my palms, I understood she meant survival. I closed the box carefully, tucking it into the inner pocket of my jacket. The phone felt small against my ribs, almost weightless, but inside, it anchored me in a way nothing else had before. Aunt Joanne didn't ask if I needed it now. She just paid for breakfast, ruffled my hair in a way that made me feel like a kid again, and walked me to the car. On the drive home, the world outside blurred into streaks of red and gold, the trees shedding their summer skins for something tougher, something more enduring. I sat stiffly in the passenger seat, one hand curled around the little box hidden in my jacket, and thought about all the ways life could go wrong. And maybe, just maybe, all the ways it could go right if I held on to that tiny sliver of escape. I didn't know when I would need that phone. I just knew someday I would. After years of silence, they reappeared, not with apologies, but with demands. It was late November, and Chicago was bracing itself for another long winter. Wind rattled the windows of my small apartment downtown, whistling through the thin seals like a restless ghost. I had just finished stringing a simple strand of white lights around my living room window, early enough to feel festive without going overboard. There was a small tree in the corner, a few ornaments I had collected over the years hanging from its branches, memories I had chosen for myself. I was curled up on the couch, a mug of tea cradled between my palms, scrolling mindlessly through my phone when the notification appeared. A friend request, Laura Carter. My breath caught before I even registered what I was seeing. It had been nearly a decade since I had last heard her voice, seen her face outside of old photographs stuffed deep in a drawer. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen, my thumb hovering uncertainly over the button. Ignore? Accept? Block? The old fear, the one I thought I had buried years ago, slithered back up my spine. Even now, with miles and years between us, it had the power to make my stomach twist into knots. I set the phone down, forcing myself to breathe through it. The flip phone Aunt Joanne had given me all those years ago was long gone, replaced by a sleek smartphone. But that feeling, the one where you needed a lifeline just to stay afloat, had never really left. When I picked the phone back up, there were already more notifications waiting. Messages, lots of them. The first few were almost normal, like Laura was trying to pretend we hadn't spent the better part of a decade estranged. "Hey, sweetie, just thinking about you. Hope you're doing well. Your father and I miss you. Wish we could catch up. So much has happened. We're getting older, you know. Things aren't as easy as they used to be." I read them, numb, watching as the tone shifted with each new message. The sweetness thinned out quickly, replaced by something sharper, more urgent. "Mom's been sick, Avery. Hospital visits are expensive. Dad hasn't been able to find steady work since the pandemic. We're struggling. You're doing well now, right? You could help us a little." I swallowed hard, my fingers drumming nervously against the side of my mug. Help us, like I owed them, like they hadn't walked away from me without a second thought when I was just a kid. Another message pinged in, this time from Peter. "You owe us." No hello, no pretense, just the bare truth of what he thought, that I was a debt unpaid. I stood up abruptly, pacing the length of the living room, the tea forgotten on the coffee table. My mind raced in tight, frantic circles. Part of me wanted to laugh. Another part wanted to scream. Mostly, I just felt tired, a bone-deep weariness that no amount of distance or success had ever really erased. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows harder. I pulled my cardigan tighter around me, shivering, though the thermostat was set high enough that I shouldn't have been cold. My phone buzzed again, a steady, grating pulse against the quiet. Without thinking, I dialed Aunt Joanne. She picked up on the second ring. "Hey, sweetheart," she said, her voice warm and steady, cutting through the storm inside me. "You okay?" I sat back down on the couch, pressing the phone against my ear like it might anchor me. "They found me," I said simply. A pause. Then a soft sigh. "What do they want?" "Help," I said bitterly. "Money, attention, a piece of whatever life I've managed to build without them." There was a rustling sound on the other end, like she was shifting in her chair. "Listen to me," she said, her voice low and fierce. "You help them if you want to, Avery, but not because they guilt you, not because you owe them anything." I closed my eyes, the weight of her words settling over me like a blanket. "You hear me?" she pressed. "I hear you," I whispered. We hung up a few minutes later, after Aunt Joanne promised to check in again tomorrow. I sat there for a long time, staring at the string of white lights glowing softly against the window pane. Outside, the world was nothing but gray sky and swirling leaves, the city preparing itself for winter's first real breath. Slowly, I picked up my phone again. The messages were still there, waiting, more piling in while I sat still. My thumb hovered over the friend request once more. This time, I didn't hesitate. Delete, block. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might break through my ribs, but a strange lightness followed too, like shedding an old skin that no longer fit. I tossed the phone onto the coffee table and leaned back against the couch, exhaling shakily. For the first time in a long time, I felt a little bit free. That's when they decided to escalate. If they couldn't control me with guilt, they would try with shame. It started with a ripple. A few Facebook posts from accounts I hadn't thought about in years. Then it turned into a wave I couldn't outrun. It was the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. In the open plan office where I worked as a designer, the mood was light and easy. People wore ugly sweaters, joked about too much turkey, planned last-minute getaways. I had been looking forward to a quiet week, to maybe finding some peace among the blinking lights and plastic pumpkins scattered around the cubicles. Then my phone buzzed. At first I thought it was nothing, a group chat, a Black Friday sale. But when I glanced at the screen, my stomach twisted into a knot. It was a tag. My name, linked to a public post on Facebook. I opened it hesitantly, half knowing what I would find. Our daughter abandoned us in our time of need. After everything we sacrificed for her, she turned her back on her own family. We never wanted to ask for help, but now we have no choice. If you can spare anything, please donate to our GoFundMe. Attached was a picture of Peter and Laura, looking pitiful, sitting in what I recognized immediately as the waiting room of a local clinic. Laura clutched a tissue to her nose. Peter stared hollow-eyed at the camera. The performance was almost impressive. Comments flooded underneath. Poor folks. Kids today have no respect. How could anyone abandon their parents like that? She must be one of those selfish ones, probably too busy living her fancy life. Each word felt like a pebble thrown directly at my chest. I sat frozen at my desk, blinking at the screen. Around me, the office buzzed on, oblivious. Coworkers laughed by the coffee machine. Somewhere down the hall, the copier jammed with a cheery beep. But my world had narrowed to that screen. Those words. More tags appeared. Old high school classmates, distant relatives. Even a former teacher who apparently hadn't seen me since sophomore year, but still felt entitled to weigh in. I forced myself to lower the phone and breathe. My boss, Lisa, leaned over the low partition of our cubicles, a sympathetic frown wrinkling her forehead. "Everything okay, Avery?" I nodded quickly, too fast to be believable. "Just family stuff." She hesitated, then backed off, giving me a tight smile before disappearing into a meeting room. By lunch, the whispers had started. Small conversations that stopped when I walked by, clients who suddenly canceled meetings with vague excuses, emails that arrived with a little too much distance in their phrasing. I wanted to scream, to demand that they see me, not the story my parents were painting online. But the truth was, I had spent most of my life making myself small and invisible around them. And now, when I needed a voice, I wasn't sure how to find it. That night, I sat by the window of my apartment, watching the first real snowfall dust the city streets in silver. Lights from other buildings twinkled across the skyline, distant and indifferent. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and clutched a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. The laptop glowed in the dark room, the cursor blinking on an empty post. What was the right thing to do? Stay silent, keep the peace, hope the storm passed, or tell the truth and brace for the backlash? I thought about the girl I had been at 14, alone at that mall clutching a bag of cold pretzels, willing herself not to cry. I thought about every silent dinner, every sharp comment disguised as advice, every moment they taught me I was something to be ashamed of. No more. With trembling fingers, I began to type. When I was 14, my parents abandoned me at a mall as a lesson. They thought it would teach me independence. They thought I would crawl back to them. Grateful for any scrap of love they decided to toss my way. I never went back. I built a life on my own. I worked 3 jobs, put myself through school, found a family and friends who chose me without conditions. And now, the same people who left me are trying to rewrite history because they need money. I'm sorry for their struggles. I am. But I will not apologize for surviving. I will not apologize for choosing peace over toxicity. I hit post before I could talk myself out of it. For a long time, nothing happened. I sat there, heart pounding, staring at the screen like it might explode. Then the notifications started. Messages from old friends I hadn't spoken to in years, former teachers, even a few strangers who had read the post and reached out with words of kindness, solidarity. I believe you. Thank you for speaking up. You deserved better. One by one, the tide turned. By morning, my inbox was flooded with support. Clients who had canceled sent apologies. My boss pulled me aside with a firm, "We're behind you. Don't worry about the noise." I hadn't expected it. Not the kindness, not the belief. Truth set me free, but it also set their rage loose. Freedom isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet closing of a door you once begged to open. Downtown Chicago shimmered under a dusting of early December snow. Strings of lights draped across every lamppost, storefronts decorated in red and gold, and the air carried that particular crispness that always reminded me of new beginnings. It was the night of our office holiday party, and for the first time in a long time, I felt fully present. The laughter of my coworkers echoed softly through the open space of the restaurant we had rented for the evening. The tables were lined with small candles and sprigs of evergreen. Someone had started a playlist of old holiday songs, the kind you couldn't help but hum along with, even if you rolled your eyes at the cheesiness. When Lisa, my boss, clinked her glass to get everyone's attention and announced my promotion, the room erupted in cheers. I stood there, cheeks flushed, accepting the congratulations with a genuine smile that didn't feel heavy or borrowed. They saw me, really saw me, not as someone broken or burdened by her past, but as someone who had built something solid, something worth celebrating. Later that weekend, when the city had quieted down and the sidewalks were slick with frozen slush, I found myself standing in front of Oak Ridge Mall. It hadn't changed much. Still the same tired awnings, the same chipped bricks along the food court entrance. But to me, it looked smaller somehow. Less like the towering maze that had swallowed me all those years ago, and more like just another building on just another street. I stepped inside, breathing in the scent of buttered popcorn and chlorine from the fountain that still gurgled near the center court. Teenagers giggled as they shuffled past, arms full of shopping bags, their faces bright and careless. I wandered for a while, my boots squeaking softly against the polished floors, past the pretzel stand, still there, still pumping out that warm, yeasty smell that used to make my stomach flip. Past the benches where families rested, their shopping hauls piled at their feet. When I reached the food court entrance, I stopped. I reached out and touched the cold brick wall with my gloved fingertips, just for a moment. There was no anger, no bitterness, just a quiet, almost surgical detachment. That chapter of my life was over, had been over for a long time, even if it had taken me this long to realize it. I whispered a silent goodbye, not because the place deserved it, but because I did. Outside, the snow had picked up again, tiny flakes swirling under the glow of the streetlights. I pulled my coat tighter around me and made my way to the diner where Aunt Joanne and I had planned to meet. She was already inside, waving me over from a corner booth, 2 mugs of hot cider steaming between us. The place was cozy, packed with families and couples escaping the cold, the windows fogged up from the warmth inside. We ordered slices of apple pie, and I let the sweetness and spice settle into my bones. Aunt Joanne talked about work, about a neighbor's new puppy, about small, beautiful things that made up her world. She didn't ask about the mall, didn't pry. She knew me better than that. As the evening wore on, the conversation lulled into a comfortable silence. I looked around at the twinkle lights strung up across the ceiling, at the people bundled in sweaters and scarves, laughing, living. "I survived," I said softly, not needing to explain. Aunt Joanne smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "I'm still here," I added, a little stronger this time. "I'm free." The words didn't carry bitterness. They didn't even feel sharp. They just were, like a truth I had been walking toward for a long time and had finally reached. Later, as I stepped back outside into the snow-dusted night, I paused for a moment on the sidewalk. The city hummed around me, alive and vast, and for the first time I felt no weight pulling me back, no invisible thread tying me to a place I no longer belonged. Some stories don't need a grand finale. Sometimes surviving is the triumph, and I had survived. Looking back, I realize freedom didn't come with a bang or a parade. It came in small, quiet choices, like choosing peace over resentment, choosing myself when no one else would. Sometimes, family is not about blood, but about those who stand by you when you have nothing to offer but your truth. In a world that moves so fast, taking the time to honor your own story is an act of courage. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear how you found your own kind of freedom. Feel free to share your thoughts.